The day Jacob Chandler rode into the town of Harrow Creek, New Mexico Territory, in the summer of 1878. The sun was so brutal and relentless that even the lizards had given up and retreated beneath the red flat rocks, and the only soul foolish enough to be standing in the open was a woman with dark auburn hair who was watching him like she already knew something about him that he did not yet know about himself. He had been riding for 3 days straight with barely a rest, crossing the Jornada del Muerto basin on nothing more than grit and stubbornness, and his horse, a dusty roan gelding named Cutter, was in a state that could only be described as mutinous. The animal had slowed to a crawl about 2 miles outside of town, and Jacob had given up trying to urge him forward any faster. You could not bully a horse that was right, and he was right. They needed water. They needed shade. And Jacob Chandler needed something to eat that did not come out of a hardtack tin that had been baking in his saddlebag since Tucson. Harrow Creek was not much to look at. It was a wide single street of sun-bleached buildings, a livery stable at the far end, a general store, a saloon called the Red Mesa that had a broken shutter hanging by one hinge, and a small church that leaned slightly to the left as if it were listening for something in the earth below it. There was a water trough in front of the general store, and that was where Jacob was headed. That was the only destination that mattered to him in that moment. He was 28 years old, lean and dark-haired, with dust so deep in the lines of his face that it had become part of his expression. He wore a canvas duster that had once been a respectable olive color, but had faded to something closer to the desert itself. He carried a Winchester rifle in his saddle scabbard and a Colt revolver on his hip, not because he was looking for trouble, but because a man alone on the road between Texas and Colorado in 1878, who did not carry a gun, was a man who was either very brave or very foolish, and Jacob had never considered himself especially brave. He swung down from Cutter before they even reached the trough, because the horse was already pulling toward it, and there was no point in the both of them pretending otherwise. He let the reins hang loose, and Cutter dipped his enormous head into the water with a sound of deep animal relief. Jacob cupped his own hands and scooped water over the back of his neck, and it ran cold and reeled down between his shoulder blades, and he breathed out slowly through his teeth. That was when he heard her voice. "That horse has got a stone bruise on his left foreleg," she said. "You ought to check before you ride him any further." Jacob looked up, water still dripping from his jaw, and there she was. She had come around from the side of the general store, carrying a wooden bucket in each hand, and she was looking at Cutter with the calm, direct assessment of someone who had spent a lifetime reading horses the way other people read weather. She set the buckets down and walked to the gelding's left side without asking permission, which Jacob noted and found he did not object to, and she ran her hand down the front of the horse's leg with practiced, unhurried confidence. Theodora Keating was 26 years old, and she carried herself with the quiet authority of a woman who had long since stopped waiting for anyone to give her permission to be capable. She was not tall, but there was something in the way she stood that made you account for her as if she were. Her eyes were a shade of brown that shifted toward amber in the direct sun, and her dark auburn hair was pinned back loosely at the nape of her neck, with pieces escaping at her temples in the heat. She wore a work dress of indigo cotton with the sleeves rolled to her elbows, and there were ink stains on 2 of her fingers, which Jacob noticed without understanding why he noticed it. "He has been favoring it since yesterday morning," Jacob admitted, "because there was no point in lying when someone was already proving you knew less about your own horse than she did. I thought it was just the terrain." "It is the terrain that caused it," she said, standing up and meeting his eyes directly. "But that does not mean you can ignore it. He needs a day's rest and some cold soaking. Mr. Hartley at the livery will sort him out." She paused. "He charges fair." "Thank you," Jacob said. He meant it plainly. She looked at him for a moment, and then she asked the question. She asked it the way someone asks a question they have been thinking about for a while but are only now deciding to say aloud. "Where are you going?" Jacob opened his mouth. He had a perfectly serviceable answer ready, the same one he gave whenever anyone asked, a name he usually supplied without thinking, a destination, a direction, a next point on the map that kept him moving and made him sound like a man with purpose. He had been giving that answer for 3 years. Denver, or Santa Fe. Or sometimes he said Leadville, because the silver mines up in Colorado always sounded like a reasonable thing to be heading toward, even if he had never once actually gone there. But standing in front of this woman with water still running down the back of his neck and the brutal New Mexico sun turning the whole world white and gold around her, Jacob Chandler opened his mouth and found that the answer was not there. Not because he had forgotten it, because when she asked it, it suddenly sounded like a different question entirely. Not where are you going on a map, but where are you going in a life? And to that question, Jacob Chandler had no answer at all. He stood there for what felt like a very long and exposed moment, and she watched him with those amber-brown eyes that did not judge and did not press, just waited. "I am not entirely certain," he said at last, and even as he said it, he heard how true it was in a way it had never been before, and the honesty of it was almost embarrassing. Something in her expression shifted. Not satisfaction, not sympathy exactly, something quieter. She picked up her buckets again. "Well," she said, "Harrow Creek is as good a place as any to figure it out," and she carried her buckets around the side of the building and was gone. Jacob stood at the trough for a long moment with Cutter still drinking beside him, and he thought about that. He thought about the way her question had found the one empty room in him and walked right into it and sat down. He looked up the length of the street, at the leaning church and the broken-shuttered saloon and the bleached board fronts of buildings baking in the heat, and he thought about Denver or Santa Fe or Leadville. Then he led Cutter to the livery. He told himself he was only staying until the horse was sound. Mr. Hartley at the livery was a compact, efficient man of about 50 with close-cropped gray hair who charged Jacob 60 cents for 2 nights of board, confirmed the stone bruise, and told him without being asked that the best food in Harrow Creek was at the boarding house run by Mrs. Esther Aldridge on the east side of the main street, and that the worst was at the Red Mesa Saloon, but that the Red Mesa served better whiskey, so it depended on what a man was after. Jacob rented a room at Mrs. Aldridge's boarding house for 40 cents a night. It was small and clean, and had a window that looked out over the back lot where someone had planted a kitchen garden, and the sight of growing things after 3 days crossing the basin was unexpectedly moving. He sat on the narrow bed for a few minutes with his hat on his knees and listened to the settlement sounds of the town around him, the distant clank of the livery, a dog barking somewhere, the low murmur of voices from the street, and felt the tension of long riding begin to leave his shoulders like water running downhill. He ate supper at Mrs. Aldridge's table with 3 other boarders, a young land surveyor named Phillips who talked about nothing but the railroad, a quiet older man named Garrity who was a retired cavalry sergeant and said almost nothing but ate with tremendous focus, and a traveling dry goods salesman from Missouri whose name Jacob forgot almost immediately. The food was salt pork and cornbread and stewed tomatoes, and it was very good, and Jacob ate more than he had eaten in 4 days. He did not see Theodora Keating again that evening. He found out about her the next morning from Mrs. Aldridge, not by asking directly, but by the natural way that conversation moved in a small town's breakfast table. Her name was mentioned in the context of a delivery of flour that was owed to the general store, which, it turned out, Theodora ran. She had taken it over 3 years ago after her father, Edward Keating, had died of a heart ailment, and she had been running it alone ever since, which Mrs. Aldridge delivered as a simple fact but which clearly implied a depth of difficulty that neither woman present required spelling out. Her mother had passed when Theodora was 15. There was no brother, no husband, no partner, just the store. Jacob listened to this without appearing to and finished his coffee and went to check on Cutter, who was in better spirits but still needed another day off the leg, which Mr. Hartley confirmed with the tone of a man who will not be argued with on matters of horses. So Jacob stayed a second day. He spent part of the morning walking the length of Harrow Creek, which did not take long. It was a working cattle and farming settlement, not a boomtown, and it had the settled, slightly worn quality of a place that had been surviving rather than thriving. There was a school building at the north end of town that looked recently painted. There was a small Mexican neighborhood of adobe homes south of the main street, separate and quieter, which Jacob walked through and recognized as the kind of spatial injustice that was so embedded in Western settlements by 1878 that most people had stopped seeing it, though the people who lived it had never had that luxury of not seeing. He thought about that as he walked back up the main street. He found himself in front of the general store without entirely having planned it. It was a solid, well-organized establishment inside. Theodora was behind the counter measuring out dried beans into paper sacks, working with a quick, practiced economy of motion that suggested she had done it 10,000 times and saw no reason to be slow about it just because no one was watching. She looked up when the bell above the door announced him, and her expression was professionally neutral. "Mr.," she said, because she did not know his name yet. "Chandler," he said. "Jacob Chandler, I wanted to thank you again for yesterday about the horse. Is he better getting there?" "Another day," Hartley says. She nodded and went back to the beans. Jacob stood in the store and felt the slight awkwardness of having entered under a social pretext that had now been discharged, and found he was not quite ready to leave. He looked around at the shelves with genuine interest because it was a good store. It was carefully stocked and well organized, with hand-lettered price cards on the shelves and a system to the arrangement of goods that clearly reflected someone who thought carefully about how people moved through a space and what they needed. "You have the medicinals arranged with the household goods," he said, because he noticed it. "Most stores keep them separate." She looked up. "People forget they need them if they are buried in the back. If you put them where someone can see them while they are reaching for soap, they remember they are out of laudanum or that their wife asked for camphor. It saves a second trip." She said it matter-of-factly, as if it were obvious, which to her it clearly was. "That is smart," Jacob said. "It is practical," she said, with a slight correction that was not unfriendly but was precise. He bought a tin of coffee and a block of soap and some dried apricots, none of which he especially needed but all of which he could use, and he paid and thanked her and left. He went back the following afternoon on no pretext at all. She was doing accounts at the counter when he came in, a large ledger open in front of her, ink on her fingers which explained the stains he had noticed on the first day. She looked up and her expression this time was slightly amused, which she did not try to hide entirely. "Did you run out of something?" she asked. "No," Jacob said honestly. There was a pause. "The coffee was very good," he offered. "It comes from the same source as everyone else's coffee," she said. But she closed the ledger and rested her hands on it and looked at him with her direct amber-brown gaze and said, "Your horse's name is Cutter. I heard Hartley shouting at him this morning." Jacob felt something loosen in his chest in a way that surprised him. "He gets contrary in the heat," he said. "He and Hartley have what you might call a difference of opinion about who is in charge." "And who is?" "Cutter mostly," Jacob admitted. She smiled at that, a real smile, not just the professional one she kept at the counter, and it changed the whole quality of her face. It was a smile that had some years in it, some experience, and it was not the smile of someone who smiled easily, which made it feel like something given rather than merely performed. "Sit down if you want," she said, with a nod toward the three-legged stool at the end of the counter that was clearly kept for customers who needed a moment's rest. "I have to finish these accounts, but I do not mind company." Jacob sat down on the stool, and they spent the better part of 2 hours in the most natural and comfortable conversation he had had in longer than he could clearly remember. She asked him questions about the road, about what the territory looked like further south, about the state of the rail lines coming up from El Paso, all practical questions from someone who ran a business that depended on supply lines and who had not had the luxury of traveling to see things herself. He told her about the country between Tucson and the Rio Grande honestly, the way it looked and smelled and how the land changed, and she listened with total attention and no performance of interest, just actual interest. He told her about himself in pieces, the way you did when you were not sure how much to say. He was from Georgia originally, a small farm outside of Savannah. He had come west after the war, though he had been only 13 when it ended and too young to fight, but old enough to see what it left behind. His family's farm had not recovered. He had headed west at 19 with $200 and a horse that was not as good as Cutter, and he had worked various things: ranch hand, freighter, briefly a deputy in a town in Texas whose name he did not offer and whose tenure he described only as brief and educational. She told him about her father's store, and the way she had inherited it more out of necessity than any plan, and how the first year alone had been the hardest thing she had ever done. Not just the work, but the way people in town had watched her with that particular kind of careful skepticism reserved for women attempting to do things that men considered theirs by default. She said this without bitterness, as a thing that was simply true and had been navigated, and he respected that. Did they come around? Jacob asked. Some of them, she said. The rest just shop here anyway because it is the only general store for 30 miles in any direction, so their opinions became somewhat less important over time. He laughed. It was the first time he had laughed and he could not remember how long, and it felt strange and good. That evening, Jacob sat on the steps of Mrs. Aldridge's boarding house in the cooling air, and thought about Theodora Keating with the focused and slightly alarmed attention of a man who recognizes he is in the early stages of something he did not plan for. He thought about the ink on her fingers and the directness of her gaze and the way she said practical instead of smart and the smile that had taken its time arriving. He thought about how the store smelled like spice and dry wood, and how she had moved through it with the confident ease of someone in their own right element. And he thought about her question, "Where are you going?" He had been moving for 3 years without an honest answer to that question, and she had found that out in under 30 seconds of conversation, not by being clever or by prying, but just by asking directly, and then being the kind of person who you could not lie to without it feeling ridiculous. On the third morning, Cutter was sound. Mr. Hartley said so in the way he said things, briefly and with absolute finality. The horse was ready to travel. Jacob stood in the livery with his hand on Cutter's neck and thought about Denver. He thought about Santa Fe. He thought about Leadville and the Silver and all the directions that had always felt like forward motion without ever actually going anywhere that mattered. Then he went to the general store. Theodora was unloading a delivery crate at the back, and she had a smudge of sawdust on her forearm, and she looked up when he came in through the back door, which he had not come through before, and she looked slightly surprised. "Hartley says Cutter is ready to ride," Jacob said. "Good," she said. She kept unpacking the crate, setting tins on the shelf with that efficient precision, long as he was in proper hands. "I need to ask you something," Jacob said. She set down a tin of crackers and looked at him fully. "All right," she said. "Do you have anyone to help you here?" She tilted her head slightly. "I manage," she said, which was an answer to a different question than the one he had asked. "I did not ask if you manage," Jacob said. "I asked if you have anyone to help." There was a pause. "No," she said. "I can do things," Jacob said. "Carpentry, basic things. I can drive a freight wagon. I am reasonably good at accounts. I worked at dry goods out of Fort Worth for 8 months. I know how stores work. I am not looking for charity. I am looking for work that makes sense, and right now, standing in this store, this looks like work that makes sense." She studied him for a long moment with an expression that was careful and thorough, and that he found he could meet without flinching, which was something. "You do not know me," she said. "I know enough to want to," he said. She looked at him another moment. "I cannot pay much," she said. "I have a horse and a room at Mrs. Aldridge's, and I need not much more than that just now," he said. "What happened to Denver?" She said, and he realized she had heard that from him in passing the day before, the vague gesture toward Colorado that he gave when he needed a destination. "Denver will keep," Jacob said. Something moved in her expression again, that same quality as the first afternoon by the trough, not satisfaction or sympathy but something quieter and more complicated. She picked up the tin of crackers again and set it on the shelf. "You can start by fixing the rear step," she said. "Third board is rotted through, and I nearly went through it twice this week." "Yes, ma'am," Jacob said. "Theodora," she corrected, "if you are working here." "Theodora," he said, and her name in his mouth felt like something that had been waiting to be said. He fixed the step that same afternoon, sourcing the lumber from the small sawmill at the edge of town, and he did it carefully and well, because he was a man who, whatever else he might be uncertain about, had always known how to do a job thoroughly. When she came out to look at it at the end of the day, she crouched down and pressed on the new board with her palm and made a small sound of approval. "Good work," she said. "Practical," he said, and she looked up at him with that delayed real smile. The weeks that followed had the quality of something being built, not quickly, not with any rush, but with the steady accumulating care of construction done right. Jacob worked in the store and proved to be genuinely useful in ways that surprised her, not because she had underestimated him exactly, but because each new thing he did well expanded her sense of what he was capable of. He repaired 3 shelving units that had been growing dangerously unstable. He reorganized the stockroom in a way that halved the time it took to find anything. He could drive the freight wagon north to the supply depot at Las Vegas, New Mexico, with a confidence and efficiency that saved her 2 full days of work every supply run, and he handled the mules without the usual drama. He also, it turned out, had a natural way with the store's customers that she had not anticipated. He was not charming in the performed way of salesmen, which she had always found alienating. He was simply direct and honest and helpful, and he remembered things. Remembered that old Carlos Mendoza from the South neighborhood came in every 2 weeks and always needed machine oil for his irrigation pump, and that if you had it ready, it saved him a difficult trip back. Remembered that young Mrs. Patterson was feeding a 3rd baby and having a hard time of it, and that slipping an extra half-pound into her flour order was the kind of thing her husband would never think to notice, but that she absolutely would and would remember. Small things. Things that added up. Theodora watched him doing these things from behind the counter and felt something in herself adjusting, the way you adjust to a new weight in a familiar space, the way a house settles around furniture that fits it. She was not a woman given to romantic sentiment. She had learned to be careful with herself in ways that other women in different circumstances might not have needed to be. Running a business alone at 23 had required her to build a version of herself that could sustain a great deal of pressure, and that version of herself was not fragile, but it was also not particularly open. She had friendships in Harrow Creek, women she liked and trusted, but she had kept the space around her heart more or less tidy and ungiven for 3 years, and she had told herself she preferred it that way, which was mostly true and partly a story she told herself. Jacob Chandler disrupted that arrangement not through grand gestures, but through the small, consistent dailiness of who he was. He made her laugh every day. Not always with jokes, sometimes just by saying the true thing about a situation in the exact right way that exposed its absurdity, and she found herself looking forward to those moments with an anticipation she recognized as significant. He argued with her. Not unkindly, but genuinely. When she was wrong about something, he said so, and he said it in a way that respected her enough to tell her the truth rather than managing her. She had not realized how much she had missed being argued with properly until it started happening. There was an afternoon in the 5th week when they had a real quarrel about the pricing of a new shipment of calico that had come in 2 cents a yard higher than expected, and whether to absorb the cost or pass it on. And they went back and forth for 20 minutes, and neither gave ground easily, and she ended up being right, which she had expected. But she had expected it to feel like winning, and instead it felt like the most alive she had been in a month. He had listened to her argument and changed his position because she had made a better case, not because she was the boss, and the distinction mattered enormously. The evenings were the time she had with him that did not belong to the store. In the early weeks it happened by proximity and accident, both of them sitting on the porch of the store after closing, while the evening came in cool and rust-colored over the desert, talking about nothing in particular, because after a day of working together there was always more to say. Then it became intentional, a thing they both prepared for without naming it, her having 2 cups of water ready at closing time, him taking the second chair without asking. The questions got deeper as the evenings got shorter with the change of season. One evening in September, with the sky doing its spectacular New Mexico violence of orange and violet above the mesa, she asked him about the war. Not about whether he had fought, she already knew he had not, but about what it had done to his family, and he told her about his father, who had come back from believing one thing about the world, and found that the world no longer supported that belief, and had spent the rest of his short life in a kind of bitter bewilderment that Jacob had grown up inside of like a weather system. He was not a cruel man, Jacob said carefully. He was a man who had built his sense of himself on something rotten, and when it was taken from him he did not know who he was, and I do not know if that earns him sympathy or not. Theodora considered this for a long time. I think it earns him understanding, she said at last, which is not the same thing. Jacob looked at her. That is a fine distinction. Most of the important ones are, she said. He realized in that moment, sitting in the coming-on dark with the last of the sunset going gold above the rock, that he was in love with her. It was not a revelation so much as a recognition, the way you sometimes know a word was on the tip of your tongue, and you finally hear someone else say it, and you know immediately that was the one. He was in love with Theodora Keating, had been probably since the first afternoon, and the fact of it sat in him as solid and real as the ground under his boots. He did not say anything that evening. He was not ready, and he thought she was not ready, and he respected the pace of things. But it changed the quality of his sitting there beside her in a way that felt elemental, like a change in atmospheric pressure, the kind you feel before a storm. He told her on a Tuesday morning in October, which was not romantic in any conventional sense, but was exactly right in every way that mattered. They had been arguing again, this time about whether to stock a particular patent medicine that had come in the catalog, which Jacob thought was fraudulent, and Theodora thought might as well be stocked since people would buy fraudulent medicine whether she sold it or not, and at least this way the money stayed local. And he had conceded again because she was again right, and she was writing the order and he was watching her write it. And the morning light was coming through the store window at a particular angle that turned the ink stains on her fingers into something that looked, absurdly, like a map, and he thought, I cannot do anything about any of this. I am in love with you, he said. She stopped writing. She did not look up immediately. There was a pause of several seconds during which the whole store seemed to hold very still, the dust motes in the window light, the sound of the street outside, everything. Then she looked up. Her expression was the most complicated he had ever seen on a human face. There was surprise in it, and something that was absolutely not surprise, and something that looked like relief, and something that looked like fear, and something that was neither of those things but sat underneath all of them like bedrock. Jacob, she said. You do not have to say anything back, he said. I just could not keep not saying it. She looked at him for another long moment. Then she said, I have been thinking about it. About it, he said. About you, she said. About this. She gestured between them in a small, precise motion. I have been thinking about it since the day you fixed the step, if you want the specific date. His heart was doing something dramatic in his chest. And she set down her pen very deliberately and came around the counter and stood in front of him, close enough that he could see the amber shifting in her eyes, and she said, "I am not easy." "I know that," he said. "This store is not going anywhere. I am not going anywhere. I am not a stopping point on the road to somewhere else." "I know that too," he said. "Then you need to be sure," she said, and her voice was steady, but he could see something trembling just beneath the surface of it, something that had been kept very carefully in place for a long time. "Theodora," he said, and he said it gently but without any doubt in it, "I have been sure since you asked me where I was going, and I could not answer. The question broke something open in me that has not closed again. I do not want it to close again. I want to be here. I want to be here with you. That is where I am going." She breathed in slowly. She reached out, and her fingers, ink-stained and capable and warm, closed around his hand. "All right," she said. Not romantically, not with any performance. Just that, all right. The way you say it when something is true and you are choosing to let it be true. He brought her hand up and pressed it against his mouth and felt her exhale, and the whole morning rearranged itself around that small thing. They were careful with it after that, careful in the way that people are when something matters enough to take care of. They did not rush. Jacob moved from Mrs. Aldridge's boarding house into the small room at the back of the store, which Theodora offered him with the reasoning that it made more practical sense for him to be on site, and which he accepted with the same practical framing, and they both understood that practical was a word they used when they were not quite ready to say the other word yet. The courtship, if you could call it that, had the texture of their whole relationship. It was built in dailiness. He brought her coffee in the mornings before the store opened, the way she liked it, strong and with no sweetener, because he had paid attention. She kept a list of things she thought he would find interesting, articles in the newspaper that came once a week from Santa Fe, things she overheard that she knew would make him laugh, and she told them to him in the evenings. He read to her when her eyes were tired from the accounts, from the Bible sometimes because she asked, and from the copy of David Copperfield she kept on the shelf behind the counter because it was the only novel she had. She had read it 4 times alone. She let him read it aloud to her from the beginning, and it was a different book that way. The town noticed, of course. Small towns always do, and Harrow Creek was no exception. The noticing was not entirely comfortable. There were those who approved, particularly women like Mrs. Aldridge, who had worried privately about Theodora going through life alone and thought Jacob Chandler was a solid and decent man, which he was. There were those who thought a drifter with no established roots was a poor match for a woman with a business and a property, and that he would leave in the spring, which was a reasonable fear, and one that Theodora herself had not entirely quieted. He did not leave in the spring. He was still there when the first hard frost came in November and helped her get the store's interior winterized, replacing the rotted window seals and reinforcing the stovepipe and laying in the wood that would see them through a New Mexico winter, which was milder than many places but still serious. He was still there at Christmas, when she made a meal and invited Mrs. Aldridge and old Garrity from the boarding house and the Mendoza family from the South neighborhood, because Carlos Mendoza had been kind to her in the first terrible year alone, and she did not forget kindnesses. It was Garrity, at Christmas dinner, who said the thing that Jacob had been working up to. The retired sergeant was not a particularly sentimental man, but he had 3 glasses of the wine that Theodora had set out, and at some point in the evening he leaned across the table and fixed Jacob with the direct and slightly unnerving gaze of a man who had spent decades assessing soldiers and said, "Are you going to marry this woman or not, Chandler?" It was not quite a question. It was more of a field report. The table went quiet. Theodora stared into her wine glass. Jacob met Garrity's eyes and then looked at Theodora, who was absolutely not going to look at him, and he felt that rearrangement in the atmosphere again, that shift in pressure, and he thought all right then. "Yes," Jacob said, "if she will have me." Theodora looked up then. She looked at him across the Christmas table with Mrs. Aldridge going slightly teary and the Mendoza children completely confused and old Garrity looking vindicated, and her expression was everything he had come to know about her, the carefulness and the strength and the real thing moving beneath both of them, and she said, "I expect you know the answer to that already." "I wanted to hear you say it," he said. "Yes," she said. "You impossible man." "Yes." Mrs. Aldridge burst into genuine tears, which she had clearly been holding in reserve for exactly this eventuality. They married in the Leaning Church on the 2nd day of February, 1879, in a ceremony that was plain and honest and exact, which suited them both. There was no elaborate dress. Theodora wore her best blue wool, which had been let out and pressed, and she looked magnificent in it. And Jacob wore his cleanest shirt and a coat he had bought from the general store's dry goods at her firm insistence, because she was not having him married in his canvas duster. The minister was a mild-mannered man named Reverend Holloway, who had presided over the church for 11 years and who knew Theodora well, and who told Jacob, privately before the ceremony, that she was the finest woman in the territory, and that he had better know what he had. And Jacob said he did, and the Reverend said good, in a tone that suggested he was prepared to take Jacob's word for it but was reserving judgment. The vows were the traditional ones, said without embellishment but with full weight. When Jacob said to love and to cherish, he said it looking at her with the direct honesty that was the whole basis of everything between them, and she received it the same way she had received everything he had ever given her, without flinching, meeting it fully. Afterward there was food at Mrs. Aldridge's, and the whole town that liked them came through, which was most of the town, and there was dancing in the street despite the February cold, and Carlos Mendoza played guitar with 2 of his nephews, and it was the kind of evening that settles into a place and becomes part of its history. At the end of it, when everyone had gone and the town was quiet and cold under a winter sky absurd with stars, Jacob and Theodora stood in the back of the store, which was their home now, and she was still in her blue wool, and he had his coat off, and they were both very tired in the particular bright way of people who have had the best day of their lives. And she leaned against his chest and he put his arms around her, and the store was dark and warm from the stove, and outside the desert was vast and silver with moonlight. "Are you happy?" he said into her hair. She thought about it with her characteristic honesty. "Yes," she said, "more than I had expected to be." I had stopped expecting this kind of happy. He held her more tightly. "I know," he said. "I do not want you to go," she said, and it came out quieter than she had intended, the old fear, the one that had been there underneath everything. He pulled back just enough to look at her face. "Theodora," he said, with that same gentleness that had no doubt underneath it, "I told you. I was going nowhere before you asked me where. I have been here ever since. I am not going anywhere that is not with you." She looked at him for a moment with all the things she had learned to keep guarded moving behind her eyes, and then she let them go, not all at once, but the way water moves through a gate when the gate is opened, and she said, "All right, I believe you." And he kissed her, there in the dark back of the store that smelled of spice and dry wood and the particular warmth of their life together. And she kissed him back with everything she had been keeping, and it was not a gentle kiss. It was the kiss of 2 people who had been careful for a long time and were done being careful now. The years that followed had more in them than either of them might have predicted, which is perhaps the most truthful thing that can be said about a life actually lived. The first year of marriage brought the discovery that living with someone and loving someone and working alongside someone are 3 different things with considerable overlap and occasional friction. And they were honest about the friction in the way they were honest about everything else, which made it manageable if not always comfortable. They disagreed about money in the first year, because Theodora had been sole financial decision-maker for years and found the adjustment to consultation more difficult than she had expected to admit, and Jacob had to learn the difference between partnership and supervision, which took some doing on both sides. They worked it out in the same way they had worked out every other thing, By talking past each other first, then stubbornly, then honestly, then arriving at something that was better than either of their starting positions because it incorporated both of them. The business grew. Jacob's decision to carry the patent medicine, which had felt like a concession to Theodora's pragmatism, ended up being the thing that introduced them to a whole category of customer who had been going to Santa Fe for medicinals and now did not have to. And the increased traffic justified expanding the store's footprint into the vacant building next door, which they were able to purchase in the spring of 1880 when the previous tenant, a failed barber, gave up his lease and headed east. The expansion was Jacob's project, which he approached with the same thoroughness he brought to everything. He drew the plans himself, working evenings at the kitchen table with graph paper he had ordered from back east, and a precision that delighted Theodora, who had not previously known he could draft. He hired 2 men from the Mexican neighborhood to do the construction, because they were the best carpenters available, and because it was work that needed doing and they needed the wages, and he paid them what the job was worth rather than what a man in his position could theoretically get away with paying, and he was not falsely modest about the fact that this distinction mattered, and that the difference in how those families ate that winter was real. In the fall of 1880, Theodora told him she was expecting a child, and the way she told him was in the characteristic Theodora fashion, directly, standing at the store counter, with the accounts book open in front of her and the practical matter-of-factness of a woman who intends to handle this the same way she handles everything, which is to say thoroughly. "I'm going to need to take on a shop girl for the spring," she said. "I will be less mobile than usual." It took Jacob a moment to process what she was telling him, and then it hit him all at once, the full weight and wonder of it, and he went around the counter and took her hands, and she looked at him with her straight amber gaze and something underneath it that was enormous and a little frightened and mostly glad. "Are you well?" he said. "I am fine," she said. "I am healthy. Dr. Haynes says it is progressing normally." She paused. "I wanted you to know." He pressed his forehead against hers. "Theodora," he said, in a tone that did not have a word in it but did not need one. She closed her eyes briefly. "I am happy," she said quietly to herself as much as to him. "I just wanted to say that out loud." "Me too," he said. Their son was born on a Tuesday morning in April of 1881, which had a rightness to it given that it had been a Tuesday morning when Jacob had first said he loved her. The labor was long and difficult, and Jacob spent most of it standing in the kitchen of their home, which was now the expanded building beside the store, pacing in a way that he was not proud of but could not prevent, while Dr. Haynes and the midwife, a solid and competent woman named Mrs. Fuentes, did their work. When Mrs. Fuentes opened the door and said in her calm and matter-of-fact way that it was a boy and both were well, Jacob sat down on a kitchen chair and put his face in his hands and breathed in a way that was not exactly crying but was adjacent to it. They named him Edward, for Theodora's father, which Jacob had suggested, and which she had received with the particular silence that meant she was moved past her usual containment. Edward Chandler was a large, healthy, opinionated baby who asserted his opinions loudly from the first hours of his life, which his parents found exhausting and somehow characteristic. He had Jacob's dark hair and Theodora's amber eyes, which was an arresting combination, and he grew into a child of tremendous energy and curiosity who was in the store almost before he could walk, pulling things off shelves with investigative enthusiasm and being redirected with patient firmness. The town of Harrow Creek was changing in these years, as most of the New Mexico territory was changing. The railroad had come closer, reaching Las Vegas in 1879 and working its way through the territory, and with the rail came more settlers, more commerce, more complexity. The cattle drives were changing. The old Chisholm operation down south was transforming as the range wars that had characterized Lincoln County in the late 1870s finally subsided, and the territory had a different energy to it, still rough and still hard but pointing in a new direction. For Jacob and Theodora, These changes were primarily commercial. The railroad meant better and faster supply lines, which meant a broader inventory, which meant a larger customer base from the new settlements. They hired 3 people in 1882, which felt like a significant crossing of a threshold, and Jacob took on the wholesale side of the business seriously, making buying trips to Santa Fe and once to Albuquerque to negotiate directly with suppliers rather than working through intermediaries. He was good at it. He was good at the dealing and the negotiation and the reading of people, which were skills that had accumulated across a long and various life on the road and which, applied to something that was actually his and actually mattered, produced results that surprised even him. By 1883, Keating's General Store, which had not changed its name because Theodora felt no compelling need to change a name that was already known and trusted in the region, was the largest and most diversified mercantile operation between Santa Fe and the Texas border, which was saying something in a territory that was filling in fast. There were hard things in those years too, because that is what years contain. In the summer of 1882, there was a drought that lasted 11 weeks and hit the ranching families around Harrow Creek badly, and Jacob and Theodora made the decision together to extend credit to families who needed it without adding interest, on the reasonable assumption that the rains would come again, and that goodwill built in hard times was the realest kind. The rains did come, and the credit was mostly repaid, and there were a handful of families who never forgot it and whose children would still be shopping at Keating's a generation later. In the winter of 1882, there was a stranger in town for 3 days who gave Jacob an uneasy feeling that he could not quite pin down. A man named Greer who had a quality of watching everything without appearing to watch anything, and who asked questions about the store's supply schedule and Jacob's travel patterns that seemed innocent but were not. Jacob mentioned it to the county sheriff, a competent man named Bellows, who thanked him and said he would look into it, and Greer left town before anything came of it. But Jacob kept his rifle in closer reach for a month afterward, and he told Theodora honestly, because they did not have secrets, and she received it seriously and without excess fear. Nothing came of it. Most fears in quiet lives amount to nothing, and the ones that do not are the ones you have to watch for, and Jacob was always watching. The second pregnancy was in 1884, and Theodora was 32 and healthier than she had been at 29, and she told him this time with less matter-of-factness and more of the real feeling underneath, standing in the kitchen early on a March morning with coffee in her hand, and the desert light coming in sideways through the window, and Edward, who was 3, still asleep in the next room. She told him, and then she said, "I think I am not as frightened this time," which was not quite true but was truer than it had been. "You were not frightened last time," Jacob said. "You were practical." "There is a difference," she agreed. He smiled at her across the kitchen. She was 32, and the lines of her face had settled into themselves, and she was more fully herself than she had ever been in any year he had known her, which was the most beautiful thing he had encountered in a life that had been, more recently, full of beautiful things. Their daughter was born in November of 1884, healthy and dark-haired like her father, and with Theodora's precision of feature, and what Mrs. Fuentes described as the most purposeful cry she had heard in 30 years of midwifing, as if the child had already decided something and was making it official. They named her Clara, which Theodora had been carrying quietly as a name for a long time for reasons she described as having no particular story, just sounding right, and Jacob said he thought it was perfect, and it was. Edward was devoted to Clara from the first moment he understood what she was, which took about 2 weeks, and once he understood, he appointed himself her primary guardian with a seriousness that both parents found both moving and sometimes exhausting. He was 4 years old and had strong opinions about everything in his world, and now Clara was the most important thing in it. In 1885, A man named Alcott arrived in Harrow Creek to open a second general store in the expanded town, and this was a development that required Theodora and Jacob to sit down and think seriously about their position. Alcott had capital from investors in St. Louis and was planning a larger footprint with a greater variety of dry goods, and the straightforward reading of the situation was that competition had arrived. Jacob's instinct was to compete aggressively on price, which Theodora heard out fully and then disagreed with, as was her right and her habit. "We cannot win a price war against St. Louis money," she said. "We do not have to. We win on what they cannot buy." "Which is what?" he said, genuinely asking. 7 years of relationships," she said. "The Mendoza family, the Patterson family, the Guthrie Ranch, all the families we extended credit to in the drought year. They do not shop here because our prices are better. They shop here because we knew their names before we needed their business." She paused. "And we need to make sure we keep earning that." It was, Jacob thought, the clearest and most complete strategic vision he had ever heard expressed over a kitchen table in a New Mexico town, and he told her so. "It is practical," she said. "Yes," he said. "You always say that." "Because it is always true," she said. She was right again. Alcott's store drew some trade, the newer settlers who had no existing loyalty and for whom price was the primary factor. But Keating's held its ground among the established families and actually grew because Theodora's analysis was correct. Their relationships were not replicable, and the decision to keep investing in those relationships rather than trying to undercut a better capitalized competitor was the right one. Alcott's closed in 1888, after 3 years that had evidently not met the St. Louis investors' expectations. Jacob and Theodora did not celebrate this, because the closure meant men out of work and a building standing empty, neither of which were things to be glad about. But they were glad to have their position confirmed, and they said so to each other honestly. The years between 1885 and 1890 were, in Jacob's later recollection, the fullest years of his life, full in the sense of containing the most of what a life could contain and remaining coherent, remaining itself. The store grew, and they managed it together with the same fundamental dynamic that had started at that counter. She was the strategic intelligence and the human center and the keeper of relationships. He was the executor and the logistician and the man who drove to Santa Fe when someone needed to be negotiated with and came back with a better deal than anyone had expected. They were genuinely complementary, which is rarer than people think and more important than most people give credit to. Their children were becoming themselves in these years in ways that were endlessly interesting. Edward, who had been a large and opinionated toddler, was a large and opinionated boy of 9 or 10, with an aptitude for numbers that made his mother say knowingly that, well, something had to skip a generation, and an aptitude for horses that made his father say proudly that there it was. He was serious and loyal, and not always easy, and Theodora sometimes thought he was the most completely himself person she had ever known, at any age, which she said to Jacob one evening, and he laughed, and said he knew exactly who that reminded him of. Clara was her own phenomenon. She was 5 and 6 and 7 in these years, bright and quick and socially fluent in a way that was remarkable in a child so small, with a capacity for reading a room and the people in it that made her sometimes uncomfortable to be around, in the way that very perceptive people can be uncomfortable, because you had the sense they were seeing things you had not shown them. She was Theodora's daughter in every meaningful sense, which Jacob said to Theodora with a kind of delighted wonder, and Theodora received this as the deepest compliment she could imagine. The winter of 1887 brought a situation that tested the Chandler household in a way that the previous years had not. A family named Breckett came to town, refugees from a failed ranch attempt further east, a father and mother and 4 children, the youngest of whom was a girl of about 7 who was very ill. They arrived in December with essentially nothing, and the Breckett father, a proud and desperate man, was trying to find work in a town that was already settled into its winter rhythms. Theodora hired him without Jacob's prior consultation, which she acknowledged afterward was perhaps not fully the partnership process they had established, but which she did not apologize for exactly. She said she had needed to make a decision in front of a man who was one more bad day from some kind of breaking, and that the decision had been obvious. Jacob had not argued. "You were right," he said. "I would have said the same thing." "I know," she said, "but I needed to do it in the moment." "Then you did," he said. The brackets stayed. The sick girl recovered slowly. With the attentions of Dr. Haynes and the practical support of Theodora, who had a very good instinct for what a sick child needed that was based on memory and observation, and the kind of embodied knowledge that came from caring for two children through every childhood illness the territory could produce. The Beckett father turned out to be a diligent and hardworking employee who learned the store operation with gratitude and competence. And by the following spring, he was managing the expanded stockroom in a way that freed both Jacob and Theodora from a job that had been taking significant time. This was important because, in the spring of 1888, Jacob made a trip to Albuquerque to investigate the possibility of establishing a wholesale supply relationship directly with a new railroad depot supplier. And on that trip he encountered, at a business meeting arranged by the Territorial Commerce Office, a man he had not expected to see. The man's name was Daly, and he had been the sheriff in the Texas town where Jacob had worked briefly as a deputy years ago, the town he had never named and whose tenure he had described only as brief and educational. He was not a pleasant encounter. Daly was a man who carried grievances the way some men carry money, carefully and with constant awareness of the current total. And he had a grievance against Jacob that traced back to a disagreement about the treatment of two Mexican workers who had been accused of theft on very thin evidence. A disagreement that had ended with Jacob resigning the deputyship rather than participating in what he considered an injustice, and which Daly had evidently spent some time nursing. He was not violent about it. He was quietly hostile and did what damage he could in the room, which was limited because Jacob had established enough of a reputation in the territory by that time that Daly's suggestions of unreliability landed on skeptical ground. But it was an unpleasant day, and Jacob rode home from Albuquerque with the discomfort of an old wound that had been pressed. He told Theodora about it that same evening, fully and without softening it, because that was what they were to each other. She listened to all of it, and when he was done she was quiet for a moment, looking at the fire in the kitchen stove. "Do you regret leaving?" she asked. "The deputyship?" "No," he said, without hesitation. "Those two men," she said, "the ones who were accused, do you know what happened to them?" "I heard later they were released," Jacob said. "Not enough evidence even for daily standards eventually. They went south, I think, back across the border." Theodora was quiet again. Then she said, "You were right to leave. A man who stays in a position he knows is wrong because leaving is hard is not someone who can be trusted when the next hard thing comes." Jacob looked at her. "That is a very specific thing to say. I have had a lot of time to think about the kind of man you are," she said, "and what that means." He crossed the kitchen and sat beside her at the table and took her hand. The ink-stained fingers curled around his, and they sat like that for a while without talking, which was one of the things about their life together that he valued more than he could easily articulate, the particular quality of their silences, which were not empty but full. In 1889, New Mexico remained a territory rather than a state, which was a political situation of some complexity and frustration for those who lived in it, particularly as other territories around them were achieving statehood. Jacob paid attention to this not as a particularly political man, but as a practical one, because the territory's political status had direct effects on land rights, on commerce regulations, on the degree of federal oversight and the associated complications, and all of these things mattered to a business family. The conversations at the supper table had changed character over the years. They now included Edward, who was 8 and intensely interested in everything and asked questions that were sometimes disarming in their directness, and Clara, who was 5 and who followed conversations with her characteristic watchful assessment. Jacob found himself telling his children things that he had only ever told their mother, about the road, about the places he had been before Harrow Creek, about the things he had seen, and the things he had thought, filtered through the need to make them understandable to a child's experience without being falsely simplified, which was a kind of honesty he had not anticipated needing and found he valued deeply. One evening in the fall of 1889, Edward asked him something that he had never been asked by anyone. "Were you happy before?" Edward said. He was 8 years old and his eyes were his mother's eyes, direct and amber. "Before you came here, I mean, when you were going places." Jacob considered this with full seriousness because Edward deserved it. "No," he said, "I was not unhappy exactly, I was moving." "Is that different?" Edward said. "Yes," Jacob said. "Moving and being happy are two different things. Moving feels like it should be the same as progress, like as long as you are going somewhere you are getting somewhere. But it depends very much on where you are going and whether what you are going toward matters to you." Edward thought about this. "So where were you going?" "Nowhere," Jacob said. "I just did not know it yet." Theodora from across the table said nothing but caught his eye, and in the quality of that exchange was everything. The whole long story of a question asked at a water trough and a man who had no answer and what that had grown into. "But then you came here," Edward said. "Your mother asked me a question," Jacob said. "What question?" Edward demanded because he was 8 and wanted specifics. "Where are you going?" Jacob said, and I could not answer. Edward stared at him with the gravity of a child processing adult information. "So you stayed because you could not answer." "I stayed because she asked it," Jacob corrected. "There is a difference." Clara, who had been listening with her fork suspended over her plate, said, "What is the difference?" Jacob looked at Theodora. She was watching him with those amber eyes and that expression that was complicated and real and completely hers, and he said, "Because the way someone asks a question tells you something about who they are. Your mother asked me where I was going, and she asked it like she actually wanted to know. Not like she was making conversation. Like she cared about the answer even before she knew me, and I had never had anyone care about that particular answer before." Theodora set down her fork. She looked at him for a long moment across the supper table with their children watching, and she said, "You have never told me that." "I am telling you now," he said. She reached across the table and covered his hand with hers, and the gesture was so natural and so loaded with all their shared years that both children, who were sharp and observant, understood that something important had just passed between their parents, and both were quiet about it in the instinctive way of children who understand when adults are having a moment. By 1890, Keating's General Store was an institution. It had expanded twice more, employed 7 people full-time, including the Breckett father whose name was Robert, and who had become a trusted and valued part of the operation, and had a wholesale account that supplied 3 smaller stores in the surrounding settlements. Theodora handled the accounts and the relationships and the strategic thinking, and Jacob handled the operations and the logistics and the negotiations, and they were together almost every hour of the working day, which they had been warned would either bond or break a marriage, and which had, in their case, done neither because they already had the fundamental basis of honesty that most marriages built toward, and which they had, atypically, started with. The thing that came for them in 1890 was not a catastrophe but was serious enough. A fire, not in the store but in the building behind it, an old structure that had been storage. It started in the night from a lantern left too close to a dry timber wall, and they woke to the smell of smoke, and Jacob was out the back door in his boots and his undershirt before he was fully conscious, hauling buckets from the well with Robert Breckett, who had been sleeping in the store's back room, and together, with a chain of neighbors who materialized from the dark town, with the particular speed of people who understand that fire in a dry climate is everyone's problem. They contained it before it reached the main store building. The storage structure was a loss. Some inventory, mostly the driest goods that caught fastest, was lost. But the store itself was unharmed, and the house was unharmed, and no one was hurt, which was the only thing that mattered. Jacob came back inside at 4 in the morning with his hands blistered and his undershirt ruined and sat at the kitchen table, and Theodora put salve on his hands with the careful competence of a woman who kept a good medical supply and said nothing until she had finished, and then she said, "I need you to hear something." "All right," he said. "I need you to hear that none of what burns can matter to me the way you matter to me," she said. She said it in the direct way she said everything that was true, without fuss. The store, the inventory, the building, none of it. I want you to hear that clearly because I am not sure I say it enough. Jacob looked at her hands on his. "You say it in about 100 other ways every day," he said. "I want to say it in words too," she said. He turned his hands over and held hers. "I know," he said. "I know exactly what I am to you, Theodora. You made sure of that from the first morning." She leaned her forehead against his. The same gesture as that day 7 years ago when he had told her she was going to need a shop girl. And he felt her breath against his face, and the solidity of her presence and the way a life built carefully with the right person could sustain the weight of things. The storage building was rebuilt by October. The inventory loss was absorbed. The insurance, which Jacob had insisted on maintaining even in the years when it felt like an unnecessary expense, covered most of the material loss, and Theodora said only that she was glad he had been right about that even if she had never officially conceded it, which made him laugh until his blistered hands ached. Their third child was born in the spring of 1892. Theodora was 40 and she knew the risks, and Dr. Haynes, who had delivered the previous two, and who was getting somewhat older himself, was clear and honest with her about those risks, and she received them seriously and without flinching, and said she understood, and that she intended to proceed. Jacob was more afraid in those months than he had been for anything, including the fire. He did not show it in a way that would burden her, because she did not need that, but she knew anyway because she knew him thoroughly, and she told him once, in the particular directness she reserved for things that needed to be said plainly, that she was not going anywhere, that she had made a long-term arrangement with this life, and she intended to honor it. The child was born in April, a boy, delivered by Mrs. Fuentes, who was still practicing at a vigorous 62, and who said afterward that Theodora Chandler was the most composed woman she had ever seen in a delivery room, which was saying something. He was small but strong, and Theodora was tired but well, and Jacob held the baby in the lamplight of the bedroom while Theodora slept, this new small person with the weight of something tremendous in his arms, and felt something that did not have a name but was the fullest version of everything he had ever meant when he used the word grateful. They named him Samuel, for no one in particular, just because it sounded true. Edward was 11 and took his new brother with characteristic seriousness, coming to examine him with the air of someone reviewing a business proposal. Clara was 7 and immediately declared that Samuel was the best thing that had happened to the family since the expansion of the store, which was delivered as a compliment of the highest order and received as such. Samuel grew up in the store the way Edward and Clara had grown up in the store, which was to say thoroughly, knowing it by heart, able to move through the stock room in the dark, understanding the rhythms of the weeks and the seasons by what needed ordering and when. He was a different child than either of his siblings, quieter, more interior, with Jacob's habit of watching carefully before speaking and Theodora's precision once he did speak. He was the child who most resembled the combination of his parents rather than any one of them specifically, and Jacob sometimes looked at him and felt a particular deep satisfaction that had nothing to do with pride exactly and everything to do with the sense of something completed. By 1895, Harrow Creek had grown into a proper small town with a newspaper, a new school building, 2 churches, a bank, a doctor's office, a larger livery operation, and 3 hotels of various quality. The railroad spur that finally reached them in 1893 had changed the character of the place, bringing more people and more commerce, and more of the territorial world closer. Keating's was well established enough to weather the increased competition that came with growth, not because of anything exceptional in any single year, but because of what had been built across every year since 1878, relationship by relationship, decision by decision. Jacob and Theodora were in their mid-40s now, and they had become one of those couples who are so thoroughly themselves together that separating the two is philosophically difficult, not because they had lost their individuality, but because their individuality had been so thoroughly informed by years of the other person's presence. She still challenged him. He still made her laugh every day. They still argued, in the good way, the honest way, and came out of arguments closer than before because they both considered changing their position based on a better argument to be a virtue rather than a defeat. Theodora's hair had silver in it now, coming in at her temples and threading through the auburn, and Jacob thought it was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen and told her so, which she received with a raised eyebrow and the observation that he was perhaps not a reliable reporter on the subject. He said, "I have been a reliable reporter on the subject of you since 1878, Theodora. My credentials are established." She gave him the real smile, the one that had taken its time arriving in that first summer, and said, "I suppose they are." There was a morning in the spring of 1896 that Jacob thought about for the rest of his life, not because anything momentous happened, but because of the quality of it. He was up before her, which was unusual, and he went out to the back of the house where she had finally planted the kitchen garden she had always planned, and which had become over the years a considerable enterprise, and he stood in the morning quiet with his coffee, watching the desert come into the day the way it did, that particular sequence of light from gray to silver to the first warmth of gold. The town was still quiet around him. The cottonwoods by the stream to the east were just starting to show their spring green. Somewhere in the distance, a cattle operation was beginning its morning noise, and he thought about the road, about the 3 days across the Jornada del Muerto in the brutal summer of 1878, with a lame horse and an empty hunger in him that he had not had words for, about the water trough and the way Cutter had dropped his head into it with relief, about the woman who had come around the side of the building with her buckets, who had assessed his horse before she had assessed him, and then had asked him the question that turned out to be the most important question of his life. "Where are you going?" He had found the answer. Not in Denver or Santa Fe or Leadville, none of which he had ever reached, which he felt no regret about whatsoever. He had found it in the answer he could not give, in the empty room that her question had walked into and sat down in, and in everything that had happened in the 18 years since then. In the store that smelled like spice and dry wood, in the 3 children who were growing into formidable people, in the accounts book and the ink-stained fingers and the raised eyebrow and the real smile and the way she said practical when she meant something deeper, in the arguments and the silences, in the hand on his blistered ones at 4 in the morning, in all of it. He heard the back door open behind him, and she came out with her own coffee and stood beside him in the morning quiet, close enough that her shoulder touched his. She looked at the desert and the cottonwood green and the light coming, and she did not say anything because there was nothing that needed saying. After a while she said, "Edward wrote. He is coming home in June." Edward was 22 now, studying at the Territorial College in Santa Fe and coming home in the summers. He had his mother's eyes and his father's capacity for thoroughness, and he was going to be, Jacob thought, a remarkable person. "Clara says she wants to work in the store this summer," Theodora continued. "Properly, I mean, on accounts. Clara was 17, and it would be another year before she was 18, and the idea of her working accounts made complete sense because she had her grandmother's capacity for numbers and her mother's relentless precision. "She can start in June," Theodora said, "when Edward is home." "You have already decided," Jacob said. "I am telling you," she said, "because that is how we do things." He smiled into his coffee. "Yes," he said, "that is how we do things." They stood there in the growing morning light, and the desert spread out around them in its enormous and indifferent beauty, and the town began to wake around them in its familiar rhythms. And Jacob Chandler, who had once been a man going nowhere in particular, stood in the fullness of his life and felt the solid ground under his boots and the warmth of his wife's shoulder against his and the completeness of a thing that had been built right, from the foundation. The answer, it had always been here. He had just needed to be asked the question. Summer came to Harrow Creek warm and generous, bringing Edward home with a new lightness about him and a girl he mentioned too carefully and too often in letters, and had clearly not yet figured out how to introduce, which Theodora noted with the calm certainty of a woman who could read between the lines of any correspondence. And Clara turned 18 in August of 1896 and sat down at the accounts desk in the store, with the focus of someone who had been waiting for this specific thing, and found it exactly as good as expected. Samuel, 4.5 now and already the quietest force in any room he occupied, discovered that summer that he had a gift for drawing, filling every scrap of paper in reach with detailed and remarkably accurate pictures of the horses in Hartley's livery, which had passed to Hartley's son by now, and the chickens in Mrs. Fuentes' yard, and the complicated mechanism of the water pump in the town square. And Jacob kept every one of them with the awareness that this was a child who would find his own language, and that his parents' job was to make sure he had room to find it. On the last evening of August, when the summer was at its most extravagant and the whole sky was going enormous colors above the mesa, Jacob and Theodora sat on the back porch of their house, while the children's voices floated through the open windows, Edward and Clara arguing cheerfully about something, Samuel already asleep, and the desert turned its evening colors, and Theodora leaned against Jacob's side the way she had leaned there for years, the weight of her familiar and real. "Are you happy?" he said. It was the same question he had asked on their wedding night, and she answered it the same way she answered everything, with honesty first and feeling following. "More than I have words for," she said, "which for me is saying something." He laughed softly and put his arm around her, and she settled against him with the ease of long practice, and the evening went on around them, the desert cooling, the stars beginning to find themselves in the darkening sky, one and then another, and then the slow accumulation of light that was the Milky Way over New Mexico, improbable and vast. "You know," she said after a while, "I have thought about that afternoon, when you first came to the trough." "So have I," he said. "I ask everyone that," she said. "Where are you going?" "I ask it because I am curious. Because I think the answer tells you something important about a person." "And what did my answer tell you?" he said. She was quiet for a moment, thinking about it in her honest way. "It told me you were a man who was ready to know the truth about himself," she said. "And that is the rarest kind." Jacob held her a little more tightly. Above them, the stars went on burning in their extravagant distances, and the desert breathed its cool evening breath around the small, warm light of the house where they had built their life, and the children's voices inside rose and fell in the timeless music of a household that had love in its walls. He thought about the road. He thought about the water trough and the lame horse and the brutal sun and the woman with the buckets and the question, "Where are you going?" He was here. He had been here since the moment she asked it. He would be here until the last road and the last question and whatever came after, and he would not trade a mile of all the miles he had ridden to get to this particular dusty water trough in this particular New Mexico town on that particular afternoon, because all of it had been necessary, every mile, to get to the moment when the answer finally came. It had always been here. It would always be here. And that was more than enough. It was everything.